Today, in our stream, we're going to be covering the causes of the Cold War, some major events, and then at the end, we'll be talking about what ended the Cold War. So we're going to kind of do like a whole like hill stream. We're going to start from the beginning, the rise up, and then back to the fall. So let's go ahead and get started. So with the background of the Cold War. So it lasted from about 1945 to 1980, and it was a major conflict between the Soviet Union and the US. So you guys probably already knew that, but those were the two main players that were involved. It's called a Cold War, like we use that terminology because there was no actual direct conflict. So there was no fighting, no shots being fired between the US and the Soviet Union. What you'll learn is that there were proxy wars and stuff like that. But again, there was no actual fighting between the two main parties of this, the US and the USSR. So just remember that's kind of like a good thing to put in your, or if you want to include this in your contextualization or something like that, just giving some background on what the Cold War is. It's always good to define the event, the time period, stuff like that. Definitely make sure you include this. Another main reason that you want to know this is that the Soviet Union had their allies in the East, the US had their allies in the West. We were basically fighting a war of ideology. So if anyone wants to put in the chat, what are the two main ideologies that were at war against one another in the Cold War? So we had the US supporting one thing and the Soviet Union supporting the other. So what were those two? If you guys could put that in the chat, if you know it. Yes, democracy versus communism, capitalism versus communism. All of these things were the main points of the conflict that occurred with the Cold War. So I know we had a question about the causes of the Cold War, so we're going to go ahead and address that. So the differences in the ideology were the main reason for the Cold War. So the United States advocated for capitalism. We have, as you know, it's the same as today, a democratic government. We thought that economic stability meant peace, and we thought a free enterprise economy was necessary for that growth. On the other hand, the Soviet Union was a communist government. They felt that the government should control all aspects of society, and the Soviets had kind of installed these governments in a lot of Eastern European countries, and Americans felt that this communism was slowly taking over Europe. They felt it was dangerous. So that was one of the main reasons why the Cold War started and that conflict started to begin with. Just remember, the main cause of the Cold War is the difference in ideologies, okay? So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Another main cause of the Cold War, kind of continuing on from what we had, is the stuff that happened at the end of World War II. So the Soviet army, like I said before, they had tried to establish these communist governments in other countries in Eastern Europe. And these countries were the ones that Germany had conquered during the war. Now, if you remember back to President Truman, this was like a main part of his presidency, the Truman Doctrine. So that was like the U.S. foreign policy that was established by Truman. And that said that the U.S. would protect democracies throughout the world. So again, it pledged that the U.S. would fight communism. And it kind of goes back to what happened with the Monroe Doctrine. So does anyone remember what happened with the Monroe Doctrine? Like, why was the Monroe Doctrine in place? What did that state? So that happened all the way back in 1823. So think about what was happening in the late 1700s, early 1800s. It was like the time of revolution, right? So during this time of revolution, with the Monroe Doctrine, what was basically established was that the U.S. was going to protect all American countries, so North and South American, Latin American, stuff like that, all of those countries from possible European invasion and, yes, European colonialism. So America really didn't have much of a plan to do it. They're like, okay, we're just going to try to threaten everyone. We're going to be like, okay, you can't come here. Okay, they didn't really have a plan to back it, but that was kind of the foreign policy at that point with President Monroe. This is kind of like a spin on that, except with containing communism. So what you'll see as a major theme, I'm sure you've already learned this with APUSH, AP World, anywhere, the main goal of Americans during the Cold War, or of the American government, was to contain communism. Okay, the main thing was containment. That was an American strategy that you will see throughout. So they were especially focused on Europe. They weren't as focused on South America just because it didn't spread there. We will see something more with the Cuban Missile Crisis and again in Vietnam. Those were kind of the outside things that happened. However, most of this containment stuff was based around Europe because, like I said before, the Soviet Union was focused on these Eastern European countries. So what the U.S. did was they instituted the Marshall Plan to reconstruct Europe, and it gave the western part of the continent aid to help it recover. So Marshall, who was the Secretary of State at the time, toured Western Europe, and he saw all of this widespread famine and homelessness. So he obviously knew that the conditions weren't great in Europe. And this led him to like an epiphany. He was like, okay, these are what the conditions are like. They're bad. But he thought, okay, if the conditions are bad, the Europeans might turn to communism because that might offer them a stable source of income, a stable source of government, just because the government would regulate everything. And that might mean that even if everything was equal and everything was meager, it still might be more than what they had then. So the Marshall Plan poured billions of dollars into Western Europe, and it helped stabilize the countries there, and it helped them to feel connected to the U.S. So this was kind of another strategy. We're talking about containment. We're trying to kind of sugar them up a little bit. We're providing help and assistance to these countries. Additionally, this justified an arms buildup in the United States. So as you guys probably have heard of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which will come later, all of these things, they were all based, everything that happened really was based around a fear of weapons. The weapons almost never were actually put into use in between the US and the USSR. However, it was the fear of weapons that kind of drove everything. So they would use military force to stop the spread, and officials supported building nuclear weapons at this time. Now, remember what had happened at the end with Pearl Harbor. Like, we completely got demolished, like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Like, this is bad. Like, we knew the extent to which the atomic bomb could kill people and really cause extensive damage. However, even despite all of this, officials still supported the building of nuclear weapons at this time. So what we'll see again now on the next slide is Vietnam. So the U.S. fought with South Vietnam to stop the spread of communism. So they were against North Vietnam. What you'll kind of see everywhere is that kind of, if it's hard for you to remember, like, we're against North Korea, we're for South Korea. Very similarly, we tend to be with South Vietnam against North Vietnam. So we fought with South Vietnam to stop the spread of communism. And our soldiers were in bad conditions. So our soldiers, South Vietnamese soldiers, even North Vietnamese soldiers, okay? There were monsoons, chemical weapons, booby traps. Around 60,000 Americans and 2 million Vietnamese people died during this time. A lot of what was different at this time was that this war was publicized. So the public was getting like daily updates through radio, television. All of this new technology that we had developed throughout the late 20th century was all coming into play with this war. Additionally, because we had so much public information, the public was more informed about what was happening. There was a lot more debate about whether America should remain involved in the war. So this was also the reason for the 26th Amendment. So does anyone know what the 26th Amendment is? It is a key amendment, especially for people like us. Does anyone remember? So the 26th Amendment, what it did, yes, it gave the right to vote. Thank you, Caitlin. It gave the right to vote to all 18-year-olds. So what people said was, I'm old enough to fight. I should be old enough. I'm old enough to vote. So they felt that if they are fighting for their country and risking their lives, they should at least, at the bare minimum, be given the right to vote, which is one of like our main like rights here that we have in the United States as citizens. So Vietnam War and 18-year-olds fighting the Vietnam War, remember that a direct effect of that was the 26th Amendment. So if you have a causation essay, anything like that, cause and effects of Cold War, impacts on America, especially Vietnam War, anything like that, definitely 26th Amendment, if you have enough information, could be a point that you use. Expansion of voting rights. Remember though, with your APUSH, your DBQs, LEQs, anything that you write, you have to make sure you have enough evidence. If you're writing an LEQ and you're like, okay, I remember he said in that stream, like 26th Amendment, that came out of the Vietnam War. Well, yes, that's a good piece of information, but you have to really be able to develop that really well in order for you to write a good essay about it. So just remember that while you're thinking about these. So these are just some pictures of stuff from Vietnam or during the Vietnam War here at home. So another thing that we saw with the Vietnam War later, again, in around this time in the 80s, later in the 80s, there was a time of basically like student protests. Like student protests really started with the Vietnam War or became like huge with the Vietnam War. And this could be seen in countries like around the world. That's just something to remember. Around this time is when the student protest movement really started. It can really be tied back into this. Okay, so the next thing that it caused was an arms race. So does anyone already know anything about the arms race? We talked about atomic bomb and how like that was severe already in our past wars and how, you know, we were trying to use it again here. Anyone? All right, that's okay. Yes, nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons were so big. Just like again, like I said before, the threat of a nuclear weapon being used was like, that was the main thing. We'll see on this last bullet, mutually assured destruction. If both, or if either the Soviet Union or the US used a nuclear weapon, like let's say the US used a nuclear weapon, it was almost certain that the USSR was going to combat or like come back at us. Okay, so that's why there was this concept of mutually assured destruction, which meant that if one did something, the other would do something to the first country, and basically both countries would be destroyed. So that's what kind of kept both countries from using the nuclear weapons in the end, because they knew it would be so bad for the people there, and eventually it would like come back and hurt them themselves. So Americans and Soviets, however, at the time really wanted to deter attacks by showing that they had a stockpile of weapons. So they were like, okay, we can at least frighten them. We can be like, okay, we have all of these weapons, and then they won't come at us. So in 1948, the Soviets tested an atom bomb, and in response to this, Truman said that the U.S. would build a super bomb. Stalin, again, he said the same thing. What the U.S. did was they tested a hydrogen bomb in 1952, and the American test of Marshall Islands literally vaporized the island. So this is what led to that mutually assured destruction thing, which kept the countries from using those nukes. They were scared that both countries, both areas, really like both economies and people, anything related to that country would be destroyed because of the force of these atomic bombs. These were not to like something to be reckoned with. Like they were bad, and they had such severe destruction that was already seen in Japan. This was like for sure going to be even worse. So that's just something to keep in mind. These are some pictures of like the possible effects and stuff it could have had. All right, the next thing that we're going to talk about is the space race. So the space race is almost something that you wouldn't expect to be tied to something history related like the war, because it's not something that I don't know, people just generally think of. They know Neil Armstrong was the first man to land on the moon, but there was so much that was involved with political rivalry. It's kind of crazy how much the space race ties in with history. So the Americans and Soviets were, like I said, were literally competing everywhere, even space. So they wanted to prove that they were more technologically advanced. So in 1957, Sputnik was launched by the Soviets, and it became the first man-made object in the Earth's orbit. So this kind of showed that the Soviets had a technological edge. So they were now on top. It showed that they had superior technology. Now, in 1958, in response to Sputnik, President Eisenhower created NASA. This was a federal agency that was established. Obviously, it still exists today, and it was made responsible for everything space related. Now, trying to beat the Soviet Union in doing stuff in space. Now, in 1961, the Soviets had another win. They put the first man into space, Yuri Gagarin, and this leads to Kennedy saying, okay, they can put a man into space. We're going to put a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s. Eventually, the U.S. is the first to the moon. In 1969, Neil Armstrong sets foot on the moon. He's the first one there. He says, like, it's a huge leap for mankind. I'm sure you know that quote. So that's kind of the culmination of the space race. All right. So does anyone have any specific questions so far of anything we've talked about with the Cold War? So this stream shouldn't be super long. I'm going to try and get you guys out of here and hopefully know everything that you need to know for APUSH Cold War in about another like 20 minutes, hopefully. But if you have any questions, again, feel free to ask them at any point during the stream. Okay, so the next thing is the Red Scare. So the Red Scare ties in directly with a concept called McCarthyism that you should definitely be aware of for the AP U.S. history exam. So in 1947, the House Un-American Activities Commission is created, and basically it began hearings to uncover communism in America. Okay, so basically what was happening, as you probably know, is that people were getting so afraid of this imminent threat of nuclear like destruction of the country, and they felt that spy communists that were living among them could play a part in this. So this is a lot like something we're seeing right now with like something like coronavirus. Like people were misinformed. They kind of knew a general idea, but they didn't know too many specifics, and therefore they were all kind of like just scared. Okay. In response to this, the House Un-American Activities Commission was created. Really, at the end, it probably scared more Americans the way it was established. It specifically accused like select federal agency employees, like from the State Department, and it forced hundreds of people in Hollywood to renounce left-wing beliefs and testify against each other. Like literally, people were being forced to testify against each other in fears that something would happen to them. With what this idea of McCarthyism is that like there was a senator named Joseph McCarthy. So that's obviously where the root comes from, where the word comes from. But what he did with the investigations was that he kind of included everybody in the federal government in this. He was like, we are going to investigate every single person or as many people as we think that could be involved with communism with the Soviets. He kind of suspected every left-wing person of communism, of supporting communism. This eventually turned into a witch hunt, and it basically like ruined people's reputations, stuff like that. It was like really to the extreme that he was going with trying to eradicate communism when probably not as much existed even within like the federal agencies. Literally thousands were investigated, fired, and prosecuted. So this was like a huge deal with the Red Scare. That's like a term that I would definitely be familiar with. I know like McCarthyism and stuff like that you've probably heard, but if you have to write a Cold War essay, like all these little things are super important. Just because the Cold War is such like a not like a uniform topic, if you know what I mean. Like it's like one topic, but there are so many different aspects that play into it. So knowing like various effects on different countries, especially different regions in America, in Europe, Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union specifically, stuff like that, that's all going to be super important, especially when you have to write an essay for the AP exam at the end of the year. All right. So again, these are some graphics about the Red Scare. If you want, you can read that, or you can just look at these graphics. These are like political cartoons that were made during that time. It just shows to what extent like people were being prosecuted for beliefs that they probably didn't even have in reality. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is a proxy war. Okay, so a proxy war is a war between two actors. Wait, let me look at this question. Okay, so what I heard from the Red Scare was that there was the Communist Party, albeit very small. Why didn't the government immediately eliminate it from the U.S.? Okay, so what I'm going to tell you here is that we still had a democracy at the time, right? We were still a democratic government. Obviously, everyone was scared of this communist kind of infiltration. However, the way that what we're going to talk about with like McCarthyism specifically is that he tried to target federal officials that he thought, or really not even he thought, they were kind of just like targeting left-wing people and accusing them of communism, basically ruining their reputations. And it almost kind of became like used as like a political method more than a like trying to get communism out of the United States. With the Communist Party being very small and the government not eliminating it, honestly, I'm not so sure what the answer to that is. However, what I would say is that the Communist Party, even if it was very small, likely did not make their presence known in a way. However, I would definitely recommend you do research on that. I'm sorry, like I don't know the full answer to your question. However, I do know that specifically with McCarthyism, it was like targeting specific federal officials, not like a whole political party of the Communist Party, because the people that were like, I don't know, the people that were involved in the Communist Party, obviously they're going to be targeted. But in terms of the Red Scare and McCarthyism, this was more like just random federal officials that possibly had some left-wing beliefs being targeted. Does that make sense, Christine? All right. Thank you. Okay, so proxy war. A proxy war is a war between two actors, state or non-state, that is taking place on behalf of parties that are not directly involved. Okay, so what are some proxy wars that you know happened during the Cold War? So I'm sure you have heard of them. So what are some of the proxy wars? I think they might be at the bottom. Okay, so some of the proxy wars are the Soviet war in Afghanistan, the Vietnam War, and the Korean War. Okay, so these are the three main examples that you should be familiar with. We already went into a little bit of detail about the Vietnam War. We're going to talk a little bit more about the Soviet War in Afghanistan. And then we will do a little with Korean War at the end. So with the proxy war, there were these three proxy wars were the main ones that were involved with the Cold War. Now, in order for it to be a part, like you're talking about the main Cold War, that is, who are the two parts? It was the U.S. and the USSR, right? Now, in the proxy war, it's like not those two actors. So it's not the U.S. versus the USSR. There are other things happening. So like it says in that definition, it's taking place on behalf of parties that are not directly involved. So those parties that are not directly involved are the main ones that are fighting this Cold War. So like I said, there's usually a relationship between the actors in the conflict and those not participating. So normally there's some other motivation or something else happening. So some of these or some examples are funding, assistance, arms. So anything where like a country like the US or the USSR is providing aid and there's some kind of conflict that breaks out, there was a potential for that to develop into a proxy war. Additionally, it allows countries to exert influence without directly becoming involved. So you wouldn't have to convince their citizens to support it. So that was kind of like a different thing. So it's like, does that make sense? Like if there was a proxy war, like the United States would not have to, the Congress would not have to approve for that proxy war to be happening. If that makes sense. Okay, so next slide, we're going to talk about proxy wars. And again, not specifically with the Soviet-Afghan War. Okay, wasn't Vietnam part of the Third World though? What prompted them to get involved with the Cold War? Okay, so let me go back to the slide where we were talking about the Vietnam War. Okay, so in terms of the Vietnam War, and you're right that Vietnam was a part of the Third World. What prompted them to get involved with the Cold War was not really Vietnam. It was the United States. Remember, the United States, the main goal was containment, right? That you were trying to contain communism. What they saw was that North Vietnam was trying to embrace communism. When they saw that happening, the U.S. kind of fought with South Vietnam to stop the spread of communism. So what was the real war here? It was really South Vietnam versus North Vietnam, okay? However, the U.S. kind of intervened, and that's how it became a proxy war. So it's kind of basically the reason why Vietnam was involved in the Cold War is because part of Vietnam was supporting or starting to support a communist type of government. And that's why, based on American policy of containment at the time, America decided to get involved there. Does that make sense? So it was more like America getting involved in the Vietnam War, which got Vietnam involved in the Cold War. Hopefully that makes sense, Christine. All right. So let's go back and talk about the Soviet-Afghan War. So this is the war that I'm going to go into the most detail with. It's good to have an example or two of proxy wars that you can go into specific detail, okay? So the Soviet-Afghan War was fought between the Afghanistan rebels, which were the Mujahideen, and the Afghan government. So the Soviet Union had a long history of providing aid to Afghanistan and their government at the time already. Now you have these rebels who are the Mujahideen, and this was all caused by a 1978 takeover by a communist government. So what have we seen so far? Obviously, Soviets like communism. America does not. When a communist government starts to take over, this communist party started to make radical modernization reforms. And at that time, a lot of rural places and the rural population did not like this reform. They did not support the Communist Party. So the government they found was hugely repressive towards them, especially like these rural farmers and stuff like that. Now, America, they primarily backed the Mujahideen. Now, why did they back the Mujahideen or the rebels? Because they were against the Communist Party. The common goal here was no communism. So the insurgent groups had some Maoist groups involved also, however, and the groups were also supported by Saudi and Pakistan. Eventually, this actually became a source of embarrassment for the Soviet Union because the war had little success. Really, they weren't able to get much out of it. It was condemned by the United Nations. If you remember, the U.S. boycotted the 1980 Olympics by decision of Carter. And then Gorbachev finally realized that the war was costing Soviet troops, and he ended up signing this peace treaty. Eventually, though, this was one of the main reasons why Afghanistan kind of shifted into a poorer country. This war destroyed a bunch of their architecture, infrastructure, stuff that they had there. This was like really a major turning point in Afghanistan's not only political and social history, but economic history. A lot of what happened because of the Soviet-Afghan War is why like Afghanistan is not that great of a, or not that wealthy of a country today. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is the Bay of Pigs invasion. So this is going to now come back to the Americas. So we were in Europe for a little bit and in Asia. Now we're going to come back to the Americas. This is in Cuba. So with the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro had led an army and he overthrew the American-backed president who was already there, General Batista. Now, Batista was corrupt and oppressive, so that was like obviously a negative thing. However, he was friendly with U.S. companies. Now, what matters to the U.S.? Economics. So they were friendly with General Batista. However, Castro was completely anti-U.S. So this was like a huge change in U.S.-Cuban relations. So he had an anti-U.S. rhetoric, and he refused to hold elections. So what he did was he intended to pursue an alliance with the Soviet Union. Now, remember, we were talking about like common goals and stuff. What was the common goal between Cuba and the United States? It was, or between Cuba and the Soviet Union, it was anti-United States, anti-democracy, right? So what happened was the U.S. government decided to finance and direct an invasion of Cuba by exiles who were opposed to Fidel Castro. So they were like, okay, we can get this group of people to come in and invade Cuba. What happened really was kind of bad. The exiles were badly outnumbered. They surrendered in literally less than a day. This was a huge foreign policy blunder for the U.S. Now, Kennedy said that he didn't really want to abandon Cuba to the communists. Really, though, this like entire like Bay of Pigs invasion caused the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy is really remembered for like the good things in terms of like resolving the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, really, he's the one that started it with getting involved with this Bay of Pigs invasion. So that's just kind of something to remember. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about the Cuban Missile Crisis. So remember, the Cuba and the Soviet Union had a common enemy in the U.S. What you'll find with a lot of these things is that these entities, these parties, they try to find a commonality between someone with them and someone else so that they can fight more effectively, so that they can develop these allies. So what the Soviets did was they tried to install nuclear-armed missiles in Cuba to threaten the United States. So this is only 90 miles from U.S. shores. And the deal between the Soviets and Cuba was the nuclear weapons had to remain secret until the missiles were operational. So basically, no one was supposed to know, especially the U.S., about these nuclear weapons until they were operational. However, some spy planes from the U.S. revealed that these sites where nuclear weapons were located those like missiles that were there could easily reach like Washington, D.C. and New York, which if you know where Cuba is, like that's a long way away. Now, President Kennedy did tell Americans about these missiles, and this started in a naval blockade around Cuba. And this was probably the height of tensions in the Cold War. Many feared that like there was a true fear that a nuclear war was going to break out. Like it was the standoff that happened was basically 13 days. Eventually, they kind of came to a peace agreement because they knew that if one fired this nuclear weapon, that mutually assured destruction that we talk about would happen, and that basically both countries would be left in ruins. Eventually, Soviet leader Khrushchev removed the missiles when the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba. So that was kind of like a peace treaty that they came up with. And this was kind of like the U.S. missiles removal from Turkey. Okay, so next slide we're going to talk about, now we're going to talk about the closing. So the Cold War coming to a close. Before we get there, does anyone have any questions about what we talked about so far? All right, so the Cold War comes to a close in detente. So in 1968, President Nixon is elected president, and he decides to use diplomacy rather than military action and threats. So this is kind of a little bit of a change. And what he does, he tries to get the UN to recognize the communist Chinese government, and he goes to China and he tries to establish relations. So he takes like a much more active role there. Additionally, he adopted this policy of détente. So détente is really important. Basically, it's another word for that is relaxation. In 1972, he signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. This is known as SALT I. You'll also see like SALT II later. With the Soviet Union. And what the treaty did and what it was good for was that it helped everyone kind of reduce their anxiety over the situation. It was kind of almost like the peace treaty that ended the no war. Like, remember I told you Cold War, there was like no actual like weapons being shot. At the end, this treaty was mainly just to relieve anxiety among Soviets and Americans that there would be no nuclear war, because everyone was afraid of this mutually assured destruction. His foreign policy success here really helped distract from his domestic policy struggles. As we know, his career as president wasn't super great. So this specific part with the SALT really did help boost his foreign policy focus. All right. So the next thing, again, we're going to talk about is the Berlin Wall. So President Reagan, who was after, he took a more direct approach. So we talked about Nixon, what he did. Now we're going to talk about Reagan. He gave military and financial aid to anti-communist governments and insurgencies all around the world. So he's literally like, okay, we don't support communism. Before they were like containment. So they were like, okay, we'll just look at the countries that are maybe trying to get a communist government. We'll be like, stop. We're going to contain communism only to the Soviet Union and where it already is. With Reagan, he was just like, no, we have to give aid to the anti-communist government so that we can stop the spread of communism. So he literally gave military and financial aid to these governments, insurgencies, and especially applied in South American countries like El Salvador. At the same time, however, Soviet struggles were like kind of leading to like negatives, a lot of negatives there. So political and economic turmoil. So as I said, like Soviet Union, it was falling apart by this time. Gorbachev, he ended up redefining Russia, and he had two main policies, Glasnost and Perestroika. Glasnost was political openness, and Perestroika was like economic and social reform. Eventually, however, by 1989, that was when the Soviet Union was basically close to dead. Non-communist governments had replaced all the communist ones in Eastern Europe. So Reagan's foreign policy especially was popular because of helping like truly end the Cold War. Eventually, when the Berlin Wall came down between East and West Germany, that's viewed as like the actual end of the Cold War. Okay, so the last slide we're going to talk about is the War Powers Act. So War Powers Act kind of doesn't really fit with like, okay, the end of the Cold War. However, it is an important piece of legislation that I thought should be included. So the War Powers Act was a law that was passed to check the president's power to commit the U.S. to an armed conflict without congressional consent. So what we had seen a lot of times was the president having too much power, the executive branch having too much power. Now, what this War Powers legislation does is that it says the president must notify Congress within 48 hours of putting out forces. So it says if you're going to start a war without telling us, you need to notify us within 48 hours. Additionally, it kind of says that the troops can't remain in action for over 90 days without congressional authorization. So if the president sends troops and he notifies Congress, Congress has to declare war or authorize those troops to be there within 90 days. Otherwise, the troops have to come back. Okay, so that's like the main piece of important legislation. And I definitely think you should be aware of because I know you'll probably see it somewhere either on your multiple choice or possibly like as an excerpt in your DBQ, something like that. Okay, so that is the end of my stream. If you guys have any questions, you can leave them in the chat. But otherwise, thank you for coming. I'm going to go ahead and go back to the weekly stream schedule so that you can see that. Just know that APUSH always streams at this time every week. And you can take a picture of this slide if you want to know of our times. Again, thank you so much for attending. Have a great night, everyone.